This traditional English folk song, Poverty Knock, is a factory worker's song, written to be sung over the rhythm of flying shuttles and clankings of mill machinery. Conditions in the cloth mills of the 1890s when this song was written were hot, noisy and dangerous. Injury and even death from the awkward and unsafe weaving machines was commonplace, and yet the continual knocking of the shuttle was at least a surety that you'd be able to eat, or guttle, at a time when unemployment still meant virtual starvation and misery. This theme of unemployment, meaning virtual starvation and misery for common people, is embedded throughout the course of English history. We find its narrative echoing down through centuries in the words of radical English preacher John Ball. He would preach in the marketplace on a Sunday as people were leaving church. His ideas raised the imagination of the peasant masses beyond the harshness of their daily lives, fusing their anger with a utopian vision, creating a revolutionary consciousness, one that was about to burst into life. John Ball's famous sermon at Blackheath in 1381 still makes powerful reading today.
In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it thou wast taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return.
He went on,
My good friends, things cannot go on well in England, nor ever will, until everything should be in common, when there shall be neither vassal nor lord, and all distinctions levelled, where the lords shall be no more masters than ourselves. How ill they have used us! They have wines, spices, and fine bread, while we have only rye and the refuse of fine straw, and if we drink, it must be water.
More revolutionary oratory was ascribed to Ball on Corpus Christi Day, June 13, 1381, when he made an appeal to the people to rise up against evil lords and unjust judges when he preached,
For when the great ones have been rooted up and cast away, all will enjoy equal freedom, all will have common nobility, rank and power.
Little wonder then that John Ball was described as the mad priest of Kent by his enemies, though to the peasants and chroniclers of the time he became one of the most eloquent leaders of the peasants' revolt.
Wretched is the infant's lot, born within a straw-roofed cot. Be he generous, wise or brave, he must only be a slave. Long, long labour, little rest, still to toil, to be oppressed. Drained by the taxes of his store, punished next for being poor. This is the poor wretch's lot, born within a straw-roofed cot.
It should be remembered, John Ball was preaching at a time when the church was the largest slave owner. 4 abbeys ruled by Alucin of York employed 20,000 slaves in England. As a result of his preaching, John Ball was imprisoned by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and on the 15th of July 1381 he was hanged, drawn and quartered for his part in the peasants' revolt. His head was displayed on a pike on London Bridge, and the quarters of his body were shown in 4 different towns. The peasants' revolt in itself is something of a misnomer. In fact, the peasants were highly skilled craftsmen, with working skills often passed down from father to son for generations. It's easy to forget in the age of 0-hour contracts and casual factory work for many in Rochdale today, these people had highly specialist skills and training. How many of us today, for example, are skilled enough to grow enough food to harvest for a family and have a surplus to barter or trade to others, or have the skills to forge iron into ploughshares or cast tools, let alone to intricately carve roughly hewn blocks of stone into the face of an angel or cherub for the outside of a monastery or a church? Committed socialist William Morris, who also designed the notable stained glass window, the Burne-Jones window at St Chad's, Rochdale, that depicts faith, hope and charity, wrote in his prose poem, A Dream of John Ball, that
Above the heads of the crowd, and now slowly working towards the cross, was a banner on a high raised cross-pole, a picture of a man and woman, half clad in skins of beasts, seen against a background of green trees. The man holding a spade, and the woman a distaff and spindle. Rudely done enough, but yet with a certain spirit and much meaning, and underneath this symbol of the early world, and man's first contest with nature, were the written words, When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?
This was Orthodox liberation theology, a clear 600 years before the Bishop of the Slums, Brazilian Archbishop Dom Helder Camara, whose famous adage, When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why they're poor, they call me a communist, went right to the very heart of the church's response to the Christian ministry to the poor and dispossessed. Camara, like John Ball, exposed one of the great fissures in the established church, bringing into sharp relief the claim of the church to be on the side of the poor. Religious reformers such as St. Francis of Assisi and John Wycliffe of the Peasants' Revolt fame, who were able to understand the Latin Vulgate, spoke out against the rich and powerful. The sharing of goods was always treated by some Christians, even if only a minority of them, as a virtue. The New Testament also laid great emphasis on the universal sharing of material goods. Christ's Sermon on the Mount eulogised the poor and the oppressed.
When he learned that the crowd had only 5 loaves and 2 fishes among them, Christ divided them equally, and a miracle was witnessed as everyone present had enough to eat. This was one of the great influences on subsequent endeavours for all people to have an adequate means of subsistence.
The appeal of this is obvious. In an age when for many life was nasty, brutish and short, the poor barely had enough to eat, certainly not a healthy, balanced diet, even when times were good. It's not surprising the medieval church authorities resisted the translation of the Bible into English. In Germany, in 1526, Tyndale translated the New Testament from Greek into English. When these reached England, the Bishop of London, fearing the jewel of the church be turned into the common sport of the people, seized every copy his agents could lay their hands on. The offending texts were burnt at St. Paul's Cross, a gathering place in the precincts of the cathedral. So effective were the bishop's methods that today only 2 copies of the original 3,000 survive. For his efforts, Tyndale was branded a heretic and he was executed at the stake in 1536. Then as now, the Bible text could be interpreted to mean all things to all people, a tool of oppression for the wealthy, or a dangerous instrument of liberation and freedom for the poor.
In what way are those whom we call lords greater masters than ourselves? How have they deserved it? Why do they hold us in bondage? If we all spring from a single father and mother, Adam and Eve, how can they claim or prove that they are lords more than us, except by making us produce and grow wealth which they spend? And therefore I exhort you to consider that now the time is come, appointed to us by God, in which ye may, if ye will, cast off the yoke of bondage and recover liberty.
At around the same time, William Langland wrote of the social and spiritual predicament of late 14th century England.
And I have a dream, a marvellous dream. I saw a fair field full of folk, poor and rich, working and wandering as the world demands. In particular, the ploughmen, who labour and till the ground for the good of the whole community.
Religious radicals such as John Ball, Gerard Winstanley and others spoke directly from Scripture to question why, if all men and women were derived from the original divinely created pair, where did the lords and ladies come from, unless it was a corruption of God's plan? Such narrative is inextricably woven into our social history, as surely as any loom weaves the raw cotton into fabric on a spinning jenny or a steam-driven cotton loom. The religious roots of many of those in the nascent labour movement was often a conflicted one. In 1888, Annie Besant spoke of how she had
seen the misery of the poor, of my sister women with children crying for bread. The wages of the workmen were often sufficient for 4, but 8 or more than they could not maintain. Christian charity, we know it is work. It gives 100 weight of coal and 5 pounds of beef once a year to a family whose head could earn 100 such doles if Christian justice allowed him fair wages for the work he performs. It plunders the workers of the wealth they make and then flings back at them 1,000th part of their own product as charity. It builds hospitals for the poor whom it has poisoned in filthy courts and alleys and workhouses for the worn-out creatures from whom it has wrung every energy, every hope, every joy.
She also discovered the health of the women had been severely affected by the phosphorus they used to make the matches. Although phosphorus was banned in Sweden and the USA, the British government refused to follow their example, arguing it would be a restraint of free trade.
Born in slums, driven to work while still children, undersized because underfed, oppressed because helpless, flung aside as soon as worked out, who cares if they die or go on the streets? provided only that Bryant and May shareholders get their 23% and Mr. Theodore Bryant can erect statues and buy parks.
The theme of religion was also to recur time and again in the wider history of the Labour movement. In 1901, the first Labour MP, Keir Hardie, said that
"We are called upon at the beginning of the 20th century to decide the question propounded in the Sermon on the Mount, as to whether we will worship God or Mammon. The present day is a Mammon-worshipping age. Socialism proposes to dethrone the brute god Mammon and to lift humanity into its place."
in the 1980s, in his acclaimed book, Arguments for Socialism, Tony Benn pointed out that
Of course, there are some Christians in the churches, just as there are some socialists in the Labour Party.
in his book, Passage in the Life of a Radical, Middleton weaver and poet Samuel Bamford described the procession from Middleton to Manchester on the 16th of August 1819, where it had been arranged for a large number of people from Middleton and Rochdale to attend the meeting at St. Peter's Field. His account of the Peterloo massacre that followed became one of the most important sources of evidence for historians of the event.
Our whole column, with the Rochdale people, would probably consist of 6,000 men. At our head were 100 or two of women, mostly young wives, and my own was amongst them. 100 of our handsomest girls, sweethearts of the lads who were with us, danced to the music. Thus, accompanied by our friends and our dearest, we went slowly towards Manchester.
After the massacre, several men, including Bamford, were arrested and charged with assembling with unlawful banners at an unlawful meeting for the purpose of inciting discontent. For their part in the event, Bamford and others were each sentenced to 1 year in Lincoln Prison. 23 years after the Peterloo massacre, in the home life of the Lancashire cotton folk, local dialect writer Edwin Waugh described the experience of the unemployed cotton workers that in many cases related directly to those who stood for reform in St. Peter's Fields only one generation earlier.
Swarms of strange, shy, sad-looking singers and instrumental performers, in the work-worn clothing of factory operatives, went about the busy city, pleading for help in touching wails of simple song, like so many wild birds driven by a hard weather to the haunts of man.
A further 2 decades passed before Mr. Cobden's speech on the cotton famine of the 1860s, where he noted that
When I was in Rochdale the other day, I heard a very sorrowful example. There was a poor woman who kept a shop, and she was threatened with a distraint for her poor rate. She sold the Sunday clothes of her son to pay the poor rate, and she received a relief ticket when she went to leave her rates. That is a sad and sorrowful example, but I am afraid it will not be a solitary one for a long time.
how right he was to prophesy that this would not be an isolated case. Here is a current example of parallels with such hard times.
Hi, my name's Chantal. That's not my real name. I was called Edna, after my grandma. How gross is that? I live with my mum and my stepbrother in a small flat in Rochdale. It was my job from as far back as I can remember to look after us all, especially my young brother Ben. He was a bit slow. Mum was usually gouched out on the settee, and I'd desperately be trying to stop Ben from crying because he was hungry, but I knew that there was nothing in the house to eat because Mum had cashed in the family allowance yesterday. I didn't get to school much as I was caring for Mum and Ben, unless she'd managed to get a few nights' work at the packing factory. Then I'd have to try and grab some money off her before she spent it all on drink or drugs. We didn't have many clothes, and when Gran tried to invite us to her church, I had to say we weren't well, because we didn't have any smart clothes kept for Sunday best to wear, just hand-me-downs from Auntie Brenda's kids next door. We existed on beans and sausages and white bread and biscuits. School holidays were the worst times. Then we didn't get our free school meals, and I'd often go hungry so that Ben could have whatever was left in the cupboard. I know that Mum loved us in her own way, and that she tried her best for us, but if it hadn't been for Gran bringing us food parcels from her church and Auntie Brenda, me and Ben wouldn't have survived.
Socialist writers in the 1930s would have been familiar with the writings of many of their predecessors who chronicled life from the mid-19th to the early 20th century. For example, Engels' classic of social research, The Condition of the Working Class in England, written in 1845, in which he charted the growth of industrialisation in Lancashire and gave vivid descriptions of life in the dreaded workhouses of the time.
The regulations for these workhouses is such as to frighten away everyone who has the slightest prospect of life without this form of public charity. The workhouse has been made the most repulsive residence which the refined ingenuity of a Malthusian mind can invent. The food is worse than that of the most ill-paid working man well employed, and the work harder. The food of criminal prisons is better, as a rule, so the paupers frequently commit some sort of offence for the purpose of getting into jail. To prevent the superfluous from multiplying and demoralised parents from influencing their children, families are broken up. The husband is placed in one wing, the wife in another, the children in a third, and they are permitted to see one another only at stated times after long intervals, and then only when they have, in the opinion of officials, behaved well.
Henry Mayhew's investigation into the plight of the poor revealed the impact unemployment, starvation and disease was having on the working class. This was published as London Labour and London Poor in 1851. William Booth's two books called In Darkest England and The Way Out, published in the 1890s, described accommodation of the poor.
There are vile dens, fever-haunted and stenchful crowded courts, where the return of summer is dreaded because it means the unloosing of myriads of vermin, which render night unbearable, which, nevertheless, are regarded at this moment as havens of rest by their hard-working occupants. They can scarcely be said to be furnished. A chair, a mattress, a few miserable sticks constitutes all the furniture of a single room, in which they have to sleep and breed and to die. Every week they contrive by pinching and scheming to raise the rents, for with them it is pay or go. If at any time work fails or sickness comes, they are liable to drop helplessly into the ranks of the workhouse.
In the mid-19th century, sleeping rough was often the only option for many. People slept during the day and tramped at night to avoid being moved on after anti-vagrancy laws were passed in the mid-1850s. Many walked all night to avoid the law, exhausting in itself. In cold weather, wrote the Ragged School Union magazine in 1864, people would congregate on the flags by bakery ovens or near warm air vents, in doorways or outside the workhouse when refused entry inside it. Going on the tramp would be nothing new to a generation of 1930s writers, such as George Orwell, who, in his first published essay, The Spike, vividly described a night spent in a Notting Hill tramps' hostel.
At the twopenny hangover, the lodgers sit in a row on a bench. There is a rope in front of them, and they lean on this as though leaning over a fence. A man, humorously called the valet, cuts the rope at 5 a.m.
Orwell was writing in 1933 at a time when it wasn't possible to get a bed at any non-charitable institution in London for less than 7p a night. This was well out of reach of the poor and destitute underclass. Orwell was, like Jack Hilton, a Rochdale writer, well aware of his place in the lexicon of writers on poverty. They'd each read Jack London's People of the Abyss. The 9th chapter of that book was also called The Spike, where he described how,
after my 2 unsuccessful attempts to penetrate the Whitechapel casual ward, I started early and joined the desolate line before 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They did not let in till 6, but at that early hour I was number 20, while the news had gone forth that only 24 were to be admitted. By 4 o'clock there were 34 in line, the last 10 hanging on in the slender hope of getting in by some kind of miracle.
Clearly, very little had changed between London's 1902 experience in Whitechapel and Orwell's 1931 experience in Notting Hill. Though few people in Rochdale and elsewhere have heard of him, Jack Hilton was the finest of all Rochdale working-class writers. Born to a poor family in 1900, he moved to Rochdale with his family as a child. After serving in the First World War, he became a plasterer and an active member of the Plasterers' Union, for which he would later be blacklisted. He raged eloquently against the dangerously squalid conditions in the slums, where he witnessed what he later recalled as the
indifference to humanity in the hearts of Liberal Methodist and Tory churchmen.
He gave a grimly damning insight into the fragility of slum life in the cobbled streets and soot-stained lungs and terraced houses of our town in the last great economic depression of the 30s, when he wrote,
Of 11 children, Maybe there were 13. 7 died before reaching 2 years. Only 4 of us became adults. My mind doesn't really recall how many brothers and sisters I had because they died too soon for me to have memories of association. This was normal for slummies.
This same Jack Hilton was bound over to keep the peace and banned from public speaking in 1932, following a disturbance at Rochdale's notorious Public Assistance Committee, during which he was struck with a sergeant's stick so hard he could hardly move his legs whilst attempting to advocate on behalf of the poor and needy of Rochdale. Hilton knew too that he was a link in a long chain going back to the Middle Ages and beyond of those who'd chronicled the lived experience of the poor and marginalised. In Caliban Shrieks, written in 1935, he described the treatment of vagrants in the late 1500s.
Vagabonds were sentenced to be branded, 5 to be hanged, and 8 set to service. Service was unvarnished slavery, and it was from the stress of such times that humanity set up its workhouses. We still have them with us.
We also have first-hand descriptive evidence by Jack Hilton of the scene in the local means test for public assistance in the middle 1930s, when he noted brutality to the poor remained, but just in a different form.
What sort of civilised action in such callousness? When you take away the last straw off the poor blighter, it's a punishment that eats into his bone.
Perhaps George Orwell's classic book about the Wigan miners, The Road to Wigan Pier, could easily have been about Rochdale mill workers if Jack Hilton hadn't suggested to Orwell that Wigan's miners were better representatives of a strong, independent working-class culture. A more recent Rochdale writer, Trevor Hoyle, in a damning indictment of Britain in the mid-1980s, the era of Thatcherism triumphant, from Coronation Street to the Kingdom of Darkness, Hoyle described,
She, who wasn't for turning, having seen off the enemy within in the form of the National Union of Mine Workers, surveyed an empire built on cant about modernisation, enterprise, freedom and choice. Communities were crumbling, homelessness spiralling, working conditions deteriorating, the welfare state unravelling, and, forgive the pun, arms sales rocketing. There was, we were told, no such thing as society. There were winners in this vast experiment in social engineering. For them, greed was good. Numbed by the summer cocktail of celebrity, affordable overseas holidays and lifestyle aspirations, they managed to avert their eyes from victims of the free market and state-sponsored violence. And the losers? They could always resort to the official sanctioned means of escape from the tidal wave of unemployment and insecurity. Norman Tebbett's hand-me-down pushbike.
Chantal!
Here, I'm here.
Yes, take a seat. Now let me have a look at your details. Oh dear, that's most unfortunate.
What? Is there something wrong?
Yes, you failed to appear at the placement that we set up for you at the People's Advisory pop-in. Therefore, you've been sanctioned for 6 weeks.
Oh, I did phone up and tell him I couldn't make it. Honest, I did. It's just that Ben was playing up, Mum wasn't well, and I just didn't have the bus fare to get there. It's 2 buses to get right over to the other side of town, you see. I couldn't leave Ben with Mum, and he couldn't walk there with me. It's miles, and he's just a little kid.
I don't want to hear it. When will people like you realise that there's always consequences to your actions?
But what am I going to do with no money coming in? Oh, I feel sick. How am I going to manage?
Well, I can give you a voucher for the food bank, I suppose. Here it is. If you hurry, they might still be open.
Thanks, Madge. Oh, God, I really don't want to go there. But I've got no choice now, have I?
The spectre of Orwell's 1930s Wigan resurfaces in Wigan Pier Revisited, Poverty and Politics in the 80s, written in 1984 by Beatrix Campbell, and also in her book Goliath, Britain's Dangerous Places, which talked to the feral British underclass and asked,
What is Britain becoming? 4 successive Conservative governments, a boom and 2 recessions have wrought seismic shifts in British social and political life.
In Owen Jones' book, Chavs, The Demonisation of the Working Class, 2011, Jones quotes Orwell's observation.
If you look for the working classes in fiction, and especially English fiction, all you find is a hole. The ordinary town proletariat, the people who make the wheels go round, have always been ignored by novelists. When they do find the way between the corners of a book, it's nearly always as objects of pity or as comic relief.
And yet again, in the Road to Wigan peer revisited by Stephen Armstrong in 2012, which identified that
Benefit sanctions were worse in Rochdale. There you'd get sanctioned for one mistake. At least in Manchester, it was usually 3 strikes and you're out. It's always the younger ones, or the new ones, or those who've never signed on who get it wrong and get sanctioned.
Hello, please come in, take a seat. Would you like a cup of tea or coffee? You look a little flustered, my dear.
No, I've run all the way here. I just need to get my breath back and I'll be all right.
Thank you. Oh, don't worry, dear. We'll get you sorted out.
I'm grateful, but to be honest, I'd never thought I'd get this low.
Shall we say a prayer together, my dear?
Well, if you want to.
Dear Lord, please bless this child of yours, and please help her to your wondrous bounty. Amen.
Amen.
Here we are, my dear. 3 bags enough for 3 people for 3 days. Would you like to help yourself for 2 tins from the out-of-date box?
Yes, please. Can I take these 2 tins of beans and sausages? Our Ben really likes these. And 3 bags of tin food won't go far with no tokens in the meter and us already on emergency credit.
Yes, of course you can, my dear. Why don't you take this little book of Bible readings as well? There's one for each day. Oh, you can read, can't you?
Of course I can. I'm not stupid, you know. Sorry. You've been really kind. I'd like to say thank you to you for all your kindness, even though I don't feel very deserving of it.
You're a child of God. He will bless you and keep you always.
I hope so, because I've got another 6 weeks of survival to manage first. Bye now.
George Monbiot points out the myth of the deserving and undeserving poor was still being used in 2015, and that vilification of the unemployed as scroungers and skivers has a long and grisly heritage.
Kindness is cruelty. Cruelty is kindness. This is the core belief of compassionate conservatism. If the state makes excessive provision for the poor, it traps them in a culture of dependency, destroying their self-respect, locking them into unemployment. Cuts and coercion are a moral duty to be pursued with the holy fervour of inquisitors overseeing an auto da fe.
This belief persists despite reams of countervailing evidence showing severity does nothing to cure the structural causes of unemployment. In Britain, it's used to justify a £12 billion reduction of a social security system already so harsh it drives some recipients to suicide. The belief arises from a deep and dearly held fallacy that has persisted for over 200 years.
Hi, Chantel here again. I wanted to tell you about how awful I was feeling after being sanctioned for 6 weeks. I felt so angry, yet helpless to do anything about it. Nobody told me about the hardship payment I was entitled to. I didn't have anyone to turn to. Being sanctioned was the new leprosy, and secretly I felt ashamed for missing that appointment and giving the DWP the excuse they needed. Returning home with the carrier bags from the food bank, I put it away in the cupboard and tried to work out in my head what meals I could cook with it. Mum was on the settee as usual, cigarette in one hand, watching telly, and Ben was in his room looking at his toy cars. I felt a wave of total despair hit me. I could just see my life never getting any better, just struggling on and on. I tried to get an appointment at the doctor's, but they only had an appointment for 4 weeks away. All the earlier appointments had been booked up by people online who had computers of their own. How could we afford to have the internet at home when we struggled to pay the tele-licence fee? I'd always suffered with anxiety, right from being little, because I was worried about Ben most of the time. Mum said I could worry for England. Yeah, I could get the gold medal all right. Fear gripped me in its icy vice. What else could go wrong? Troubles always come in threes, don't they? Superstitiously, I'd always saluted magpies if I saw them, and I tried not to tread on cracks in the pavement just to ward off the bad luck. Even when something good happened, like Auntie Brenda coming round and bringing us some food or clothes, I always looked over my shoulder, waiting for something awful to happen, to balance it out. I found myself going down the spiral of despair fast this time. Not sleeping, not eating. Ben could always use my share of the food. And feeling apathetic. All the fight had gone out of me. Somehow, I managed to drag myself out of the door and get to the free phone in the library to talk to the woman at the CAB. Overloaded with work as she was, all she could advise me was that she could just give me a voucher for the food bank. So I thanked her and hung up in tears. At the desk was a card advertising the Samaritans. I picked it up because I felt I was just despairing enough to ring them.
Whilst we've focused on local issues in the industrial north, it shouldn't be forgotten workers in rural settings suffered similarly. The Tolpuddle Martyrs were a group of farm workers in Dorset who in 1834 were sentenced to 7 years transportation for daring to form a trade union to protest against wage cuts. Protests against the severity of these sentences led to 100,000 people marching in London and a petition of 800,000 calling for the men's pardon. Although it would be several decades before workers' right to organise was finally enshrined in law, the legacy of the Tolpuddle Martyrs was a significant landmark in the development of trade unions. A play written to mark the 150th anniversary of the event contained a song that was taken up by striking miners on the picket line in the 1980s. This has become an anthem for trade unionists everywhere, and it seems a fitting place to finish. Chantal postscript, because we all love a happy ending, don't we?
Hi, Chantal here. Just to let you know, I'm going to be okay. I got home and looked at the photos of my gran on the wall, and I realised that I'm a strong person, just like her. I've not always been strong, though. Sometimes I dream about Crispin. He was the only man who was really kind to me. He made me feel beautiful and a worthwhile person. I fantasised about him holding me and telling me that it's going to be all right. Because I get scared sometimes, you know. But mostly I know that I can cope. I've done that before and I can do it again. They call it resilience, don't they? Well, I know that I've got it in spades. I love my mum and our Ben, and they love me. So I've got hope for the future. I just have to hold on and wait for better times.